Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
This week on To the Contrary, religion in America. What role does religious affiliation play in the country's culture and politics? Bay. Welcome to the Contrary, a weekly discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. We step back and take a deep dive into the following questions. What is the state of religious affiliation and observance in America? And if, as the newest data show, fewer Americans believe in God or go to church regularly than in recent decades, why are so many politicians competing for the votes of the religious right? Joining me today are former U.S. House member Donna Edwards, a Maryland Democrat, and libertarian Tiana Lowe Doescher, columnist for the Washington Examiner. A couple of weeks ago, we discussed a new public religion research poll and compendium of data on the state of Americans and their religious affiliations. We are revisiting that study today because we didn't have time to take a deep dive into these incredible findings and to view them from the perspective of their massive impact on American women's social progress and particularly why this decreasing group of Americans control so much of the politics, laws, judiciary, and in turn, political culture today. Among the findings of this study are that only 16% of Americans say religion is the most important thing in their lives, way down from previous decades. 36% say religion is one among many important things. 18% say religion is not as important as other things. 29% say religion isn't important to them. A combined total of almost 60% of Americans say they seldom or never attend religious services. So Donna Edwards, welcome, and Tiana, welcome. Donna, why does the religious right still have this stranglehold on American politics when their numbers are dropping?
Well, I actually wonder if they do, because if you look at the top issues of the day, the things that are driving voters, they are completely apart from where some of these, especially evangelical congregations are on issues like abortion, for example. And so I think that voters may be doing one thing and saying another when it comes to their alliance or not to these religious traditions.
So you think they're telling pollsters they're not that allied, but they are?
Well, I think when it comes to issues, for example, if you look at from the 2018 to 2022 election, the issues that won out where voters were being driven to the polls were not, like on the abortion issue, for example, clearly Americans support strong abortion rights. Their churches may be telling them one thing, but they are voting in another direction. And so it's not really clear to me that there is such a stranglehold on the American voter when it comes to their affiliation with whatever their religious tradition is.
Well, but clearly there's a stranglehold, Tiana, on the GOP party and its politicians, its members of the House and Senate, because they're all adhering to whatever the Christian right, the evangelicals tell them that the topic should be. Otherwise, young people, such as yourself, but young people generally, they don't care about LGBTQ. They just see that's the new normal for them. And they don't want to go after them in most instances. They're the ones being told by their churches to oppose it.
Bonnie, I think that what you're saying actually isn't strictly true as of 2015. My colleague Timothy Carney at the Washington Examiner wrote the now famous book, Alienated America, which determined through the data that the most statistically significant indicator of whether a Republican primary voter would support Donald Trump specifically in 2016 was lack of religious affiliation. Other candidates did better with evangelicals, Catholics, Muslims, Jews, whatever you want to put in there. It was that social alienation. We know in the studies that having genuine religious beliefs is correlated with higher happiness, but so is just religious attendance. With regards to the way that the faith-based community is still influencing Republican politics, I think in some ways it's been for worse, right? We saw a lot of, in some sects of the evangelical church, there was a good degree of explaining away why they would back a thrice married man who had cheated on all three of his wives, allegedly. But at the same time, it was also those same evangelicals who were instrumental in pushing the First Step Act ahead. That was not a secular movement. That was a religious Christian movement, because if you look at the center of what the Christian faith is, it is the idea that the only unforgivable sin is to believe that God cannot forgive you. Obviously, there are some churches that are very political on both sides, right? You hear about some Methodist churches waving the rainbow flags in the middle of the congregation. You hear some MAGA churches talking about how Donald Trump is our second Lord and Savior, which to me is antithetical to Scripture. But I don't think that most people.
I think the Methodists. First of all, we should, as long as you brought up Methodists, the church internationally is splitting. In the middle of splitting over the LGBTQ issue. And there are plenty of Americans who don't want the church to be friendly towards LGBTQ friendly. But also, you talk about them going to church, saying, yeah, I'll do whatever you want, pastor, blah, 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 and then voting a different way. How do they reconcile that?
Because, Bonnie, I think that a lot of, especially young Christians, I'm not necessarily going to speak to the younger Jewish and Muslim experience, but for a lot of us, we can all recognize that the Old Testament is a multi-thousand-year-old book written in Hebrew, and the New Testament is a 2,000-year-old book written in a specific dialect of Greek that nobody actually speaks anymore. I think that logical, reasonable people can recognize that we can have scriptural differences, and also people who do, let's say, believe in the more traditional definition of marriage, they can also differentiate what they want allowed in their own congregation versus a government certificate. When I got married, I did not care about the government certificate. I was like, all right, this is about taxes. For me, the only thing I cared about was the religious element of the sacrament of marriage. I think a lot of people go to church specifically to avoid that. Right now, everything is politics. For me, I am an Eastern Orthodox Christian who goes to a non-denominational, mainline Protestant church. And I love that it's my one respite from politics.
Well, I mean, Tiana, on one hand, you say a lot of people are going to church, but the data actually says that a lot of people are not going to church, and that particularly among young people, they are not identifying with the radicalism in some of these churches, that that young people separate faith and spirituality from the act of going to church. Young people are far more tolerant than they have been in any other generation of Americans, tolerant of LGBTQ, tolerant on abortion rights, tolerant on race, tolerant on a lot of those isms that have separated other Americans. And I think that is a direct correlation in their separation from these, sort of orthodox and mainstream religions.
But Donna, just in the same way, you gotta separate, the worst adherents of people who purport to purvey Islam, but are really perverting it for their own political goals. You have to disassociate that from Islam, the religion. You have to disassociate the worst of Jesus's followers with Christ's teachings. So a lot of people, I think, are alienated by those who give religion a bad rep. Like, I think of someone like Jerry Falwell Jr. at Liberty University is just the most flagrant example of this Trump-era evangelical hypocrisy and decadence. But more people would be benefiting turning to it. Because look, human beings are social animals. We need stories to live. We need religion to live. If you do not abide by a good religion, I think like one of the main monotheistic religions, I think Islam, Judaism, Christianity, we're pretty related. We do it pretty well. If you don't believe in one of those, it becomes a lot more appealing to believe in Donald Trump as your Lord and Savior rather than Jesus Christ, a sinless man, right?
Except that if you look at the political parties, you look at the Democratic Party, and it is this menagerie, if you will, of religious traditions. Sort of every single stripe. You look at the Republican Party, and it is the narrowest group of religious adherents, which I think it actually accounts for some of the intolerance that you find in the Republican Party. Look, I attend a Baptist church, either online or in person, every single week. I grew up in the Baptist church, but I also accept that there are other religious traditions that I have respect for and value for. And I think that you find that among Democrats, not in the same way that you find this kind of religious adherence in the Republican Party.
But Donna, I was going to ask you to get, to bring in the perspective of African Methodist Episcopal Church members. Are they the same way as white evangelicals, white Christians, about going to church and maybe not paying attention to what their pastors, preachers tell them to do?
First of all, I'm a Baptist. But I have attended a lot of AME churches. In my former congressional district, I had, dozens of large congregations, mega congregations, over 1,000 people. I think one of the churches in my district had like 16,000 members or something. And so people attend those churches. But if you look at the voting habits among Black voters, that largely Black voters are voting with, sort of the more progressive traditions in the Democratic Party. I think that that's for a lot of reasons, not necessarily having to do with religion, but having to do with tolerance around issues around race that really drive, and history, historic perspective that drive Democratic voters. And I think that you still find that the Black church in its history has always been sort of an organizing mechanism. It certainly was during the Civil Rights Movement and is and remains that way today, even though along with other churches, there's been a loss of membership among some of those churches.
Donna, just to go back to exactly what you're saying, this is what I mean about separating the worst of Jesus's followers with Jesus's message. There is a reason why it was the Christian faith that was so galvanizing, not just during the Civil Rights Movement, but as we rightly restored the rights to Black Americans to be full citizens when we realized that chattel slavery was wrong.
It wasn't all Christians.
It wasn't all Christians.
I mean, there is a real difference, though, in the way that white evangelical Christians, in fact, so many of them who actually left those mainline churches. I'm thinking, for example, in the Southern Baptist Convention, over the question of race.
Yes.
And so I think it's important to understand the context of where the separations are among white Christians and where the movement is among civil rights and other activism in Black churches.
And look, I believe that all Christians can have doctrinal differences about these way more modern concepts, such as things like gay marriage, right? Such as things like gender identity. I'm not going to tell anyone they're a bad Christian for disagreeing with my opinion, right? But if you don't believe that we were all created equally by our Creator, that Jesus loves all of us, regardless of how much we sin, because we all do, you are not following his word. You are perverting it, right? It was Jesus who goes to the woman at the well, who talks to the Samaritan woman, who crosses those crucial lines of class, race, and gender. That was a radical concept at the time. It was provocative, and it's part of the reason why the Romans wanted Jesus dead. It's a radical message to say everyone is worthy of being saved. And the only thing it takes to do it is with faith in Jesus Christ and in his sacrifice.
All right, Donna and Tiana, we need to move now from religion in church to religion in politics. from abortion and women's rights to LGBTQ rights. Many Americans joined the church-led movements against abortion rights or against gay rights through their churches. If, as we just discussed, the number of religious conservatives is dropping, why are they gaining political power? For starters, they elected a president in 2016 whose Supreme Court appointees overturned a woman's right to choose national legal precedent for a half century. In the almost year since the U.S. Supreme Court overturned federal protection for a woman's right to choose abortion, some 20 states have passed laws banning abortion or placing significant restrictions on those rights. About the same number of states have laws upholding a woman's right to choose and or have recently added new laws enhancing those rights. About half of states are expected to try to enact bans on abortion or gestational limits on the procedure. In some of these states, abortion remains legal for now as courts determine whether bans can take effect. Abortion remains legal in the rest of the country, and many states have added new protections since Dobbs.
Tiana, if you look at the list of states, red states essentially, that have passed bans or much tighter restrictions on abortion, if you add up the population of all of those states versus the states that have kept abortion legal and even strengthened it, they are a much smaller group of population. So for them to be waging a campaign against an issue that most of the country polls show, something in the range now, ever since Dobbs, support for abortion rights has gone up to about 70%. Is this a tyranny of the minority, or what's working here? What's going on here?
Well, no, because luckily the Supreme Courts did what they should have done all along, which is return this issue to the states on a federal level, right? It's why, Lindsey Graham's 15-week federal abortion ban is misguided. Not only is it bad as a matter of pragmatism, right? The last time Republicans had 60 seats in the Senate was over 100 years ago. The last time Democrats had it was a little over 10. But it's also just a matter of the law, right? This should not be determined at the federal level. The average American is begrudgingly pro-choice with limits. The average American does not, when you poll them, they do not support abortions for any reason, but they also don't want it to be banned up and through the first trimester, right? And so you have a lot of deal making because I think that the reasonable Democrat and the reasonable Republican, pro-life, pro-choice, recognizes that there's a massive difference in the conversation between doing a D&C of a 12-week fetus that, does look more or less like a sack of cells versus what is legalized in Colorado, which is for any reason you can terminate a pregnancy before a 9-month fetus is born. That is what the law is there. It is the most permissive in the nation. And you know what? If that's the cost of federalism, that's probably better than making this where it's this national war.
What we know from the data is that the overwhelming majority, 2/3 of Americans, support abortion rights. The overwhelming majority were supportive of the limits and the restriction in Roe versus Wade, which the Dobbs decision overturned. People are dissatisfied with Dobbs. What Tiana has described is precisely the reason that we need a federal umbrella over the states, because with every state, with all of these different restrictions, some of them restricting women even from crossing state lines to get an abortion. I know when I was pregnant, I didn't know at 6 weeks that I was pregnant with my son. It's not enough time to make an informed decision about what choice needs to be made. Women should have the ability to make that decision for themselves. They don't need a politician in Washington or in Alabama making that choice for them. And I think that this issue, just as it was in 2022, is going to be the determinant issue for elections across the country in 2024.
I want to go back to the days Griswold and then Roe and then the backlash, essentially the religious right was not prepared for the Roe decision. And it took them a couple of years to get organized. And at least way back then, they said, because this was an issue I was covering closely at the time, they said, don't worry about birth control. We're not going after birth control. We're only going after abortion. And now here they are going after birth control. So,
Bonnie, can I just correct the record here?
Yes.
Bobby Jindal, over a decade ago, was campaigning for the presidency, endorsing making oral contraceptives over the counter at a federal level. Joni Ernst and Chuck Grassley reintroduced a bill a couple of months ago to do just that on a state level. Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, a rising star in the GOP, also made at the state level oral contraceptives over the counter. South Carolina, where I am right, or South Carolina, whose former governor I just met with, Nikki Haley is campaigning on expanding contraception access. This is the winning issue.
And she's got about 1% of the Republican vote right now.
So, but here's my thing. If you guys want to get something done, Joe Biden's FDA is right now considering making one birth control formulation that has been on the market for over half a century over the counter. Where is the rest of the Democratic Party browbeating Biden until he demands that his FDA does that, not just with this one mini pill, progesterone-only pill, but with every other pill that's been on the market for more than 40 years? There is no reason I should need a doctor's prescription to get oral contraception.
I've often wondered, is this what many people do refer to as a tyranny of the minority? Is it Democrats' fault in that it's always been a huge effort for Democrats to get their people to the polls? And yet Republicans, maybe because they think they're being commanded by their religious leaders to do it, they just show up. The GOP has very little historical effort in terms of GOTV, get out the vote. Democrats, that's 2/3 of the election.
Bonnie, what are you talking about? We've lost 7 out of the last 8 popular votes.
Let me speak to what Democratic voters are doing, because I think that if you look at 2018, it was Democratic voters that showed up. If you look at the national elections in 2020, it was Democratic voters who showed up, and the results showed that. Even in 2022, where there was predicted to be a landslide after the Dobbs decision, it was Democratic voters that showed up, which is the reason that Republicans in the House only have a narrow majority, a very slim majority, and Democrats were able to take the Senate. And so,
right, but that was because finally the Supreme Court had overturned Roe, when it was clear what was coming for years and years and years. When I first started covering politics in the 70s and 80s, women, particularly Democratic women, went to the polls and they voted for abortion rights. And then all of a sudden, they start taking it for granted.
Because, Bonnie, my generation has a completely different environment. Not only do we have long-acting reversible contraception like IUDs, like the Obamacare mandate, which does cover the contraception mandate, thanks Obama, right? But also, I think that our generation of feminists are a lot more affirmative about helping women actually have it all. I think it must have been much harder 50 years ago to try and have a career and have children.
Tiana, you actually are not really consistent with where your generation is. Your generation overwhelmingly supports abortion rights. I mean, it does. And the reason that it supports abortion rights is because your generation, men and women, affirm the ability of women to make a choice for themselves, to decide when, whether, and how they want to have children. That's where your generation is. And you are actually quite far afield from where the other women and men are in your generation. They support abortion
I don't know.
rights.
I mean, I guess it's, since I can't get anyone on board with the idea that the FDA should be clearing more oral contraception to have over-the-counter distribution on a federal level, maybe I am extreme, because clearly other people aren't with me on this. This is something that Joe Biden's FDA could do tomorrow.
True. Tiana, that's actually not
Donna,
true.
do you support it or not?
If you look at every women's organization, and myself included, we support the ability of the FDA to clear more over-the-counter abortion contraceptions, as well as making abortion pills available over the counter. And so I think it's actually unfair. And if you look at the decision even last week or week before of the FDA, the announcement from the FDA that there were Planned Parenthood and other groups calling for more access to over-the-counter medication. And so you really should be clear about where we are. You're not the only one out there calling for greater access to contraception.
I'm not saying I'm the
All
only
right,
one.
thank you. Thank you both so much for this deep dive. You've done a great job. We've shed a lot of light on an issue that is probably confusing to many people, not just myself. That's it for this edition. Please keep the conversation going on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
You're watching PBS.